It is the summer of 1944, and somewhere in the American-held interior of France, a remarkable scene is unfolding. Behind a chain-link fence, rows of German prisoners of war sit. In the afternoon sun, men of the Wehrmacht, soldiers of the Reich, beaten men by any military measure. They have surrendered. Their weapons are gone. Their comrades are retreating across France. By every logic of war, these men should be broken. They are not. They are laughing. Not the nervous laughter of men trying to seem brave, but genuine, easy, relaxed laughter, the kind you hear at a pub on a Friday evening. They are watching the American guards, young men in olive drab rifles slung at their shoulders, pacing back and forth in the heat. And something about those guards, their movements, their manner, something is striking the Germans as absolutely hilarious. The guards do not understand German. They do not know what is being said, but they can hear the laughter. They can see the pointing, and that laughter drifting across the wire is doing something no artillery shell can do. It is making the Americans feel small. Word travels as word does in an army. It passes from the guards to their officers, from the officers upward to the chain of command, until eventually it arrives, perhaps over dinner, perhaps in a briefing room at the desk of the man least likely to tolerate it. General George S. Patton, commander of the 3rd Army of Man, who had built an entire military persona around the idea that Americans were the finest soldiers on earth. The Germans were laughing at his men, and Patton, with characteristic directness, wanted to know exactly why. What he would discover was not simply a matter of discipline, nor morale, nor the natural contempt that professional soldiers sometimes hold for their captors. What he discovered was a problem that ran far deeper, a structural, cultural, and doctrinal failure that had been quietly festering in the American military's approach to the prisoner of war system from the very first days of the European campaign. Understanding how that failure happened and what was done to fix it tells us a great deal about how armies actually function, and how pride, assumptions, and the arrogance of victory can become liabilities just as serious as any enemy weapon. By the middle of 1944, the United States Army was processing prisoners of war on a scale that had no real precedent in American military history. Before D-Day in June of that year, the Army had established procedures for handling prisoners drawn largely from theoretical planning and limited experience in North Africa and Italy. The assumption baked into the training manuals and the thinking of military planners was relatively straightforward. German soldiers, once captured, would behave as soldiers were supposed to behave. They would be sullen, perhaps defiant at first, but ultimately compliant. They were prisoners. The natural order of things, conqueror and conquered, would assert itself. What American planners had not fully accounted for was the extraordinary degree to which the German military had prepared its own men for exactly this scenario. The Wehrmacht and the SS had spent years drilling into their soldiers a very specific psychological posture toward captivity. German soldiers were taught that being taken prisoner was not necessarily the end of their usefulness to the Reich. They were instructed to resist not with violence. That was impractical, but with information, with discipline, with a careful, deliberate manipulation of their captors. They were taught to observe, to assess, to identify weaknesses, and crucially, to maintain a sense of collective superiority even behind the wire. It worked remarkably well. German prisoners arrived in American camps with something their captors had not expected: organization. Senior NCOs and officers, even in captivity, maintained strict authority over their men. Camp hierarchies were formed within days of capture. Soldiers who cooperated too readily with American interrogators were identified, pressured, and sometimes violently punished by their fellow prisoners. The internal discipline of the German prisoner population was, in many camps, more rigorous than the discipline imposed from outside. American interrogators, meanwhile, were working with methods that reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of who they were dealing with. Interrogation doctrine at the time relied heavily on what might be called the comfort and rapport approach. Provide the prisoner with decent conditions, establish a human connection, and information would follow naturally. It was not an unreasonable theory. For many prisoners from other armies, it produced results. For hardened Wehrmacht professionals, it produced exactly the laughter that reached Patton's ears. The men brought in to address the problem were not, at first glance, obvious candidates for the task. The Military Intelligence Service Language School, based at Camp Savage in Minnesota and later Fort Snelling, had been training German-speaking interrogators for several years. Many of its graduates were Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria, men who had fled the Reich in the 1930s and who brought with them not only fluency in a language, but an intimate, lived understanding of the culture, the class structures, the military traditions, and the psychological landscape of society they had left behind. They understood what made a Prussian officer tick. They understood the difference between a Bavarian conscript and a committed SS ideologue. They understood, in ways that no textbook could teach, the precise buttons to press and the precise levers to pull. These men, many of them serving under anglicized names to protect family members still in Germany, began to overhaul the entire approach to prisoner interrogation in the European theater. The changes they introduced were not dramatic in the Hollywood sense. There were no bright lights or raised voices. What they brought instead was a forensic precision. Clear as throat, interrogators began by doing something deceptively simple: listening. Not to what prisoners said in formal sessions, but to what they said informally in the mess halls, in the exercise yards, in the moments when they believed they were not being observed. German-speaking intelligence personnel were inserted into prisoner populations posing as fellow detainees. Conversations were monitored, boasts were noted. The internal hierarchy of each prisoner group was mapped with the same methodical care that an engineer might apply to a circuit diagram. What this revealed was extraordinary. German prisoners, confident that their captors could not understand them, spoke with a freedom that was operationally priceless. Unit designations, officer names, morale assessments, forthcoming operations that soldiers had overheard or deduced. The information was there, flowing freely. It simply required someone capable of collecting it. The physical environment of interrogation was redesigned as well. Interrogators studied the precise psychology of their subjects, rank, background, ideological commitment, and tailored their approach accordingly. An officer whose identity was rooted in the Junker aristocracy responded to very different pressures than a working-class conscript from Ruhr. Flattery, deployed with surgical accuracy, could open doors that confrontation slammed shut. Implying that a prisoner's commander had already talked, whether true or not, could dissolve loyalty with remarkable speed. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The operation results, once the new methods began to take effect, were significant. In the weeks following the Normandy breakout, American intelligence units began extracting actionable information from prisoner populations at a rate that surprised even senior planners. Specific examples are difficult to enumerate in full because a great deal of the relevant documentation remained classified for decades, and some portions have never been fully released. What can be said is that interrogators working in France and later across the Rhine consistently provided tactical intelligence that arrived in time to influence decisions on the ground. There are accounts, some documented, some surviving only in memoir form, of prisoner interrogations that produced information leading directly to the identification of German artillery positions, the location of command posts, and the timing of counterattacks. The psychological manipulation of senior German officers, in particular, yielded results that went beyond the tactical. Several high-ranking prisoners, carefully cultivated over days and weeks by skilled interrogators who understood precisely what appealed to their sense of professional honor, provided assessments of German strategic intentions that proved accurate in hindsight. In the camps themselves, the atmosphere shifted. The easy confidence of the prisoner populations, that collective sense of superiority that had produced a laughter pattern found so galling, began to erode as it became clear that the Americans were no longer quite as legible as they had seemed. The discovery that conversations in German were being understood, that the internal hierarchy of prisoner groups was known and mapped, that the facade of organized resistance was increasingly transparent. This produced, in the words of one American intelligence officer, whose report survives in the National Archives, a visible and measurable change in prisoner demeanor. The laughter stopped. It is worth comparing the American approach once reformed with the methods employed by the other major powers. The British had been at this longer. By 1944 MY-19, the branch of military intelligence responsible for prisoner war exploitation had developed a system of considerable sophistication, centered on a facility at Trent Park in North London, and later at a network of sites known collectively as the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center. The British approach, refined across nearly 5 years of war, was perhaps the most complete in the world at the time. German generals and senior officers held at Trent Park were housed in conditions of surprising comfort, good food, access to books, pleasant gardens, while every room was extensively bugged. The conversations that resulted over months of comfortable captivity produced intelligence of the highest order. The Germans, by contrast, had developed interrogation methods that relied far more heavily on direct pressure, a reflection, perhaps, of a military culture less interested in the subtle manipulation of individuals than in the extraction of information by the most efficient available means. German interrogation of Allied prisoners produced results, but the systematic exploitation of psychology and language that characterized the best Allied methods was largely absent. The Soviet approach was its own category entirely, and lies beyond the scope of this account. What distinguished the reformed American method was the speed with which it adapted. The British advantage was experience. The American advantage was scale and the willingness, once the problem was identified, to learn with extraordinary urgency. The refugee interrogators of the Military Intelligence Service, men who had every personal reason to want the right defeated, and who brought to the task an understanding of German psychology that no training program could fully replicate, were the critical variable. They were, in the bluntest terms, the solution to Patton's dinner table problem. The legacy of what happened in those camps and interrogation rooms in 1944 reaches further than the immediate operational results of the Second World War. The recognition that psychological understanding, linguistic fluency, and cultural intelligence could be as militarily decisive as artillery or air power had a profound influence on how Western armies subsequently thought about intelligence work. The techniques developed and refined during this period, the careful mapping of prisoner hierarchies, the exploitation of overheard conversation, the tailoring of interrogation to individual psychology, became foundational to the doctrine of military intelligence as it was practiced through the Cold War and beyond. The refugee interrogators themselves, men like Gunnar Kosser, Victor Barbed, and dozens of others who served under names that disguise their origins, received remarkably little public recognition for decades. Their contribution was classified, their methods controversial in the sanitized retrospective accounts that tended to dominate popular histories of the war. It was not until historians began working through relevant archives in the 1980s and 1990s that a fuller picture began to emerge of exactly what these men had accomplished. Today, the history of the Military Intelligence Service Language School is commemorated at the National Japanese-American Memorial in Washington, D.C., which acknowledges the Japanese-American soldiers who were its most celebrated graduates. The German and Austrian Jewish refugees who contributed so significantly to the European theater are rather less prominently memorialized, a gap that historians have increasingly sought to address. Some of the camps themselves survive in altered form. Fort Hunt in Virginia, one of the primary processing sites for high-value German prisoners, is now a National Park Service property, and oral history projects conducted in the early 2000s captured the testimonies of several surviving interrogators before that generation passed entirely from living memory. Return now to that summer afternoon in 1944. Return to the fence and the laughter and the American guards who do not know why they're being laughed at. What that laughter represented was not, in the end, a product of German superiority. It was a product of a gap in understanding, in preparation, in the basic appreciation that war is not only a contest of weapons and logistics, but a contest of minds. The German soldiers behind that wire were not better human beings than the Americans guarding them. They were not braver or stronger or more resilient. What they were, in that specific moment, was better prepared for a particular psychological contest that captivity involves. Patton's instinct to be angry, to demand answers, to refuse to accept that his soldiers were the object of contempt, was right. It was exactly the right instinct. The mistake would have been to leave the anger without an answer, to dismiss the laughter as a trifle, to assume that the natural arc of the war would eventually sort things out. Instead, the anger became a question. The question became an inquiry. The inquiry found the refugee interrogators, and the refugee interrogators remade the system. The Germans behind that wire had something the Americans needed to understand, not just the military information locked in their memories, but the psychological reality of what made them tick, what made them proud, what made them vulnerable. The men who had fled Germany with nothing but their language and their understanding of the culture they had left behind turned out to possess exactly the tools required. It is a particular kind of historical irony, the sort that the actual record of war produces with a regularity that fiction could never sustain. The Reich that had driven these men out, that had stripped them of citizenship, property, family, and identity, had in doing so handed its enemies a precise instrument required to crack open minds of its own soldiers. The laughter behind the wire did not last, and when it stopped because the Americans had learned to listen, not with anger, but with the cold, professional patience of men who understood, finally, that the most dangerous thing you could do to any enemy is truly understand him.